This is the ultimate 3D printing filament beginner's guide. We're gonna answer every single question you have regarding filament. This topic can be extremely confusing because there's a million different types of filament. By the end of this video though, you're gonna understand 3D printing filament. Let's get started. So the first question that always comes up is, what type of filament do I need for my 3D printer? And that kind of depends on what style 3D printer you have. They come in all different makes and models, but I'll tell you that like 95% of the entire industry uses the same roll, like size for their 3D printers, and that's the 1 kilogram size roll of filament. And as you can see here, 99% of all my rolls are that size. So most 3D printing manufacturers make their 3D printers to fit these rolls. For example, this 3D printer essentially just has a spool holder on the side there, and whatever size roll you can fit on there, it can work. For example, this is a smaller roll and it would fit right on there, but you can see the size difference. Whereas a different style 3D printer, like this one right here, it has a multicolor unit, and you can see I have to have this particular size filament roll because it slides right onto that holster and it has to fit perfect. This 3D printer can only take this particular size of filament roll. So take a look at your 3D printer and try to figure out what type of spool holder it has. Here's another example of a single color 3D printer. This just has a basic spool holder and it just kind of fits right on the side there. But like I was telling you guys, 98% of all 3D printing manufacturers use this size. It's a 1 kilogram roll filament. If you jump on Amazon, this is most likely the sizing you should get. The next question you're gonna ask yourself is, what brand of filament do I have to get for my 3D printer? Because it's a bit confusing, right? So the 3D printer manufacturers, they all make their own brands of filament, right? Which is kind of confusing because you would think you'd have to use that brand of filament for the 3D printers, but you don't actually have to do that. For example, this is an Elegoo brand of filament right here, which Elegoo makes 3D printers. You'd think you have to use this on the 3D printers, but you don't. You can pretty much use whatever brand you want on any 3D printer. For example, this is a flash forged 3D printer, and I am using Elegoo filament on this 3D printer just fine. And that begs the next question, why is this? Why do the manufacturers make their own brands of filament? And I think they do this for the fact that people a lot of times are gonna buy that brand filament if they buy the 3D printer. You're gonna find that in the 3D printing space, all these brands are gunning for the same thing, and it's money. So this 3D printer here is a Flash Forge Creator 5. You could use 4 different brands of filament entirely, and it won't make a difference. And I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. So even though the brands are different, the plastic itself is extremely similar. So if these are 2 different brands of PLA filament, which is a type of filament, their plastic makeup is gonna be very close the same even though they're different brands. And we'll talk about some more variables on what makes up different qualities as far as like expensive versus cheap, etc. So another very common question when it comes to filament is the diameter, which is essentially the sizing of the thickness of the filament itself. So here is the tip of the filament. Think of it like the thickness and how thick that filament is. It's the diameter of it going all the way around. And when it comes to figuring out what diameter your 3D printer needs, it's kind of going to depend on the nozzle of your 3D printer, which is essentially under here, which is the part that's actually heating up the filament and it's displacing into the model itself. But I will say that 98% of all FDM 3D printers that you buy right now are a size 0.4 millimeter nozzle. And that means that they're all gonna use a 1.75 millimeter size in diameter of filament. Like if we look right here, it says diameter 1.75. And this next number is the variance, meaning how much variance is their thickness on the small side and the high side. So to simplify that, you're gonna probably need a 1.75 millimeter size of filament, the diameter, which honestly, I haven't bought any filament that is not that diameter. But I think that's valuable information to know when it comes to buying filament for your 3D printer. Okay, next I wanna talk about filament roll sizes, because this is kind of a big deal, right? So earlier I talked about the main size of rolls being a 1 kilogram roll size, right? But there are different sizes. We have a 1/2 kilogram size right here, and they have ginormous rolls as well. But you have to be careful when buying what size roll you need for your 3D printer. So like I was telling you before, take a look at it. Most 3D printers take the 1 kilogram size roll, like I was telling you before. As you can see here, this is a spool holder, and it just fits on here perfect. This is a 1 kilogram size roll. Especially if you have like AMS units or multicolor units, chances are they fit perfectly in there, the 1 kilogram size roll. My advice to you is to just look at your 3D printer and figure out what style of roll or what size roll fits best. But 99% of all of my 3D printers on this channel that I've owned to date take that 1 kilogram size roll the best. Next, I want to talk about filament types, right? So the most common filament types, especially if you're a beginner, I would suggest for you to start with PLA and PETG. There's a couple basic ones. And also, I have a dedicated video talking about all of the most popular types of filament and what they should be used for. I will link that in the description down below if that interests you. Every single day that goes by, they're creating new filaments that do different things. The amount of selection you have to choose filaments now for your 3D printer, it's mind-blowing. And it can be extremely overwhelming. But if you're new to this, I highly suggest that you stick to the basics like PLA, PETG, master that for a while, and then slowly tiptoe into some of the more obscure filaments like ABS, ASA, carbon fiber. There's so many of them. But like I said, I have a dedicated video devoted to that. I'll put it in the description. The next question you might have is, how do I know what types of filament that I can print on my 3D printer? And there's gonna be a couple variables that tell you this. Number one, do you have an enclosed 3D printer? If it's enclosed like this, you're gonna be able to print more types of filaments, because a lot of the more exotic filaments actually need temperature controlled to be kept at a stable temperature as it prints. And also, what type of nozzle do you have on your 3D printer? Because some of the filaments are a lot different and burn differently for the nozzle. It's also worth knowing that some of the filaments give off fumes as you 3D print it. So you have to look at your 3D printer. Does it have vents to where you could possibly vent those fumes out of the 3D printer? These are just some variables that are gonna tell you what types of materials you can 3D print. For example, this is an open 3D printer right here. So we're gonna be limited on printing things that need stable temperatures, and also we can't control the fumes like I was talking about before. Another common question is, where are the best places to buy this 3D printing filament? And I think the obvious answer is going to be online, right? So you're gonna save a lot of money by buying the filament online. But I'll also say that I think we should support small stores when possible. So if you have a 3D printing store near you, go support local business. Another super common question I get regarding filament is, what are the best brands of filaments to buy? And yes, that is a tricky one to answer. What I personally do is I go after the tried and true big brands that have been around forever. Well, actually, this hobby isn't even that old, so that's a bit hard. But there's a handful of brands that have been favorites across the hobby for quite a while now. And if it helps you, I'll link some of my favorites down in the description down below. And yes, there'll probably be affiliate links. You're just kind of supporting my family and what I do here. So following that question, talking about the best brands, I think what follows that next is, what is the difference between buying expensive filament versus buying cheap filament, and does that difference matter? The differences between buying cheap filament for your 3D printer versus expensive are a couple of variables that I think you should know. So the first one is obviously the quality of plastic that they use, which by looking at the filament, we probably can't really tell, right? You're not gonna be able to tell how high quality this plastic is just by looking at it, which is highly unfortunate. So that's kind of where you just kind of have to go with trusted brands that have been around for a long time. The next variable is, how well is the filament put on the roll? Because a common issue, what happens is the filament actually gets tangled, and as it's 3D printing, your entire 3D printer comes to a halt because the filament gets tangled and it's unable to pull it off the roll. This is a common issue with cheaper brands in quality of filament. So you have to be careful of that. Cheaper brands are known for that to happen. And another variable that happens here is, like I was telling you guys before, the diameter of the filament is 1.75, right? But with cheaper versus expensive filaments, this number right here, which is the variance, makes a big deal. So as the 3D printer is printing your filament, if this variance in diameter is too large, what's gonna happen is your 3D print is going to get messed up and we're going to have a lot of fluctuations. Because what happens here is as the nozzle of the 3D printer is printing, if that diameter is changing, the 3D printer has too much variance and it just doesn't lay down the layers as well. And again, that's me putting it about as simple as I can for you beginners. So the whole expensive filament versus cheap filament, what I tend to do is just be somewhere in the middle, right? Don't buy the cheapest you can find, but maybe also don't have the most expensive filament. And again, I'll put some of my favorite brands of filament down below in the description. Next, I want to talk about a filament dryer because a lot of people ask questions on this and it is definitely worth talking about. So a filament dryer is essentially a small box with a heating element that heats up the filament and it dries out the moisture in the filament. So a lot of people don't know this, but filament is actually plastic and it absorbs moisture, essentially water, over time. And depending on what type of filament, some of them absorb moisture at a faster rate. And sometimes what happens here is when your filament sits out in the open, depending on how much humidity is in the air around you, it absorbs moisture. And then when you go to 3D print this, you can run into problems. That's where a filament dryer comes in. Now I know this is kind of annoying to use, but this has saved me so much time. What you do is you throw your filament in the filament dryer and you give it set amount of time. It usually tells you right on the filament dryer. So it uses heat to remove the moisture, and then when you go to 3D print it, it's gonna print a lot smoother without that moisture. So the big question is, do you need a filament dryer? So there's a couple of variables that depend on this. How much moisture is there where you live and how much moisture is in your house? And also what type of filament it is. I wasn't completely sold on a filament dryer in the beginning, but I think I am now. And that kind of segues into the next topic of filament storage. So what you can do is to stop that moisture from being absorbed into your filament, what you can buy is sealant bags. You probably notice when you buy a brand new roll of filament that it comes vacuum sealed. And that's to prohibit moisture from getting absorbed into your filament. So a piece of advice, when you're done using the roll of filament, what you can do is buy one of these vacuum seal kits. They're actually pretty cheap on Amazon and they come with this small little like sucking pump and you kind of just remove the air out of the bag. It's really simple. Throw some desiccants in there, but by having better storage of our filament is going to stop and minimize that moisture from being absorbed into the filament. And it's going to save a lot of issues down the road. If I'm being really honest, I'm really bad at filament storage. My ADHD kicks in and I'm just kind of like on to the next print and I just throw the rolls of filament anywhere, but that's okay. With a filament dryer, all you have to do is kind of just throw that roll of filament in the filament dryer for a bit and it dries it out. And again, I'll link filament dryers down in the description as well. The technology of filament has just gotten crazier every single year. We essentially have every single color variant. We have glow in the dark, we have shiny, we have matte, we have glitter. Pretty much anything you can imagine as far as like a color variant, we have in 3D printing filament. This was the ultimate 3D printing filament beginner's guide. Hopefully this answered every single question you have regarding filament. Hit me up in the comments down below if you have any other questions. Don't forget to subscribe. And guys, before you go, YouTube thinks you're gonna love this next video. This is one of my best videos to date, and I'm confident it's gonna suit you. Guys, the video's still on the screen. I think you should actually really click on the video. I guess I gotta go.